Okay, this is the third of the sort of intro presentations. I just made a few changes to the PowerPoint, so I'm going to switch the PowerPoints out in the Canvas site. So make sure you're looking at the current one when we do this, otherwise some of this will look a little out of place. Last time I finished up with this whole sort of issue of culture, society, and how this sort of really simple but complicated concept is seen both in the discipline of anthropology, but also how it's used, and I would say sort of abused and misused by the general population. Sorry. A lot of this has to do with the issue of sociobiology, which I sort of referred to earlier, and it's actually sort of listed somewhere in one of these terms. Sociobiology is a logic that, or an argument that social behavior is inherited. In other words, you acquire talents, abilities, and all sorts of other stuff based on your genetic background, i.e. your parents. So you're born with. Most societies have this. Now, it's important to remember from one society to another, they have totally different views of what is sociobiology. But the concept is common in most societies. And in some, it's very formalized. For example, in Chinese society, if you ever look at the calendar of New Year's, like I've got here in my office, the Chinese are very explicit that not only who you're born of, but the time you're born, literally the hour, the day, the year that you're born, shapes your behavior and your potentials. And to the extent that you don't marry people outside of a certain set of these sort of package groups. So some societies have this in a very formal way. American society has it to a great extent, I think in part because almost all the ethnic groups in the United States have some concept of sociobiology. Now remember, the key is they don't share what that is. In the sense they don't agree on what you inherit. But it's a standard truism, in sort of normal American society, that if you are artistically inclined, that you inherited that from someone in your family, older member of your family who has the same set of skills. So, athletic potential, artistic ability, all sorts of other things are seen as inherited traits. Hate to tell you this, folks, but it doesn't work that way. To a certain extent, athletic ability based in inherited physical traits, yeah, you're 7 feet tall, it gives you an advantage for playing basketball. But other than that, the ability concept, hand-eye coordination, your mental construct, how you see the world around you, your ability to verbalize stuff, that's not, you don't acquire that, you learn it. So this gets back to that whole idea of culture being a learned thing. And this becomes important because when you bring in the concept of ethnicity, the idea of sociobiology becomes even more apparent, but in very sort of complicated ways, which everyone sort of thinks they agree on, but in reality they don't. And if you ever want to see it here, discussions on who's Hawaiian is probably one of the classic ones. Though if you're in some place like Asia, or especially in Japan, who's Japanese would be an equally good example, though it doesn't, for most folks here, and probably most of you, that really doesn't sort of, relate because you haven't been exposed to it. But the Hawaiian one is of course, is a huge issue here in Hawaii. Who is a Hawaiian and who isn't? Where I grew up, it'd be who's particular of a particular Native American tribe like Cheyenne or Arapaho and who isn't. And in part because of American structure, which was very based in blood. If this goes back to the whole issue of African American and other groups being, still today in some cases pretty radically, down deemed as less than, with the idea that your inherited abilities either can give you benefits or can be constraints against you. And this is the aspect that it's tied to, for example, to colors or skin or physical features, is pretty uniquely American. In other societies, it's tied to other factors. For example, Japanese make no distinction what you look like. It's whether you're entirely born and raised and live in Japan. So they have an entirely different view of who is a member and who isn't a member, though they share the idea that it's based in inherited traits. So when you're looking at the relationship of culture versus ethnicity, it's within, again, this context that the general society uses the word ethnicity and culture in very different ways, and usually synonymous, versus in anthropology, they're seen as very different things. The key thing to remember is ethnicity originally, its original structure, is not the choice of the members that are labeled. Ethnicity is something that a group in authority or the group that has the power to make decisions labels a group. And in doing so, they say this group of people is an ethnic group. Now, it might be that they share a different cultural background, it might not. But nonetheless, they get labeled as that. So ethnicity comes from a particular historical, political, power-based sense of relationships. And that's the initial stage of it. Now, at some point in time, what happens is the group that becomes labeled. So the group that's labeled, for example, Chinese in the United States, or more accurately, Asian Americans in the United States, since for most Americans, they don't see different ethnic or different cultural groups. They actually have this large vague category called Asian Americans, in the same way they have American Indians or Native Americans. They don't really have a concept that you've got literally 120 different cultures. So that thing, what happens is over time, if you're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Filipino, or anything else, and you're on the mainland, the boxes you check are listed as Asian, and the way that people relate to you are Asian. So what happens is over time, you can either fight it, but you don't have the power to make change when this originally occurs in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's the way the boxes are printed. The power elite, which are Anglo-American, that's what they want to call these people. and want to call them Asian. So you're stuck with it. And eventually you can either fight City Hall or you can just sort of give up and accept the fact that that's what they're going to call you. And so what happens is that group that's labeled as Asian American eventually sort of resigns themselves to the fact that outside of their own community, that's how they're going to be seen. Okay. The third stage is what happens is that group that has been labeled and usually stereotyped and usually in a negative way eventually gets tired of the stereotypes or tired of the segregation attached to the labels. And because of social, political change and other factors, they become very aggressive in starting to actually try to take control of the label. So you don't see this here in Hawaii, at least I haven't. But if you go to the mainland, you'll actually find that there's Asian American dolls, there's Asian American coloring books for kids. I'm not sure if there still were, but there were Asian American shows. So what you get is the folks that were part of that group, which we would consider Chinese, Japanese, Korean, whatever here, on the mainland over the last 100+ years had been labeled as Asian. And in the larger context had sort of gotten to the point where they resign themselves to that label. But in the last, say, 20, 30, 40 years, have basically started to take control of that label and say, if you're going to talk about us as Asians, then we get some say in what that is. And so you find, for example, in movie and cinema in general, there's an Asian American group that basically vetoes or protests against bad images of Asian Americans in the films. So what you get is whereas before that would never have happened. What you get is the group that has been labeled, that had to suffer with the labels and put up with the labels. Over time gets to the point where it tries to take control of the stereotypes and the labeling to make change for whatever reasons. So those are the three stages of ethnic. So initially ethnic is where you label a group and they have no say in it. You just call them whatever. Second stage is they get to the point where they understand that that's the label they've got. They don't like it, but they're stuck with it. The third stage is that label then gets sort of morphed as the group that was labeled starts to very aggressively start to take control of that concept. And I see this a lot with, of course, the whole issue with Hawaiians here. The idea of Hawaiian as it gets defined was defined by the power elite in the 19th century in terms of who was Hawaiian, who wasn't. And eventually, the folks that were Hawaiian, which was a culture, becomes defined as an ethnic group. And then in a later period of time, the last 50, 70 years, what you find is the group that is Hawaiian then comes and starts to get pretty aggressive about starting to try to take control of the way they've been labeled, the way they've been stereotyped, and what's been attached to the idea of being, quote, Hawaiian, unquote. That's the process of ethnicity. Now, the other part of ethnicity, which is really hard, it's actually easy if you think about, if you're from here and you think about either yourself or your relatives or friends but I think on the mainland, people don't tend to think about this very much in many cases. Ethnicity requires two parts to it. Part one is who the individual sees themselves as. So if the individual says, if you ask them, what are you? Or they volunteer, I'm Japanese. Okay. And that's the ethnic group they see themselves as. That's one half of it. So they identify with whatever the package is for that group. The second is the group that here in Hawaii or on Oahu would call themselves Japanese or local Japanese, would have to accept them as a member. Now, you might remember in the last couple of years, there's been a fair number of cases of this on the mainland. There was some lady in Washington, I think, who said she was Native American, and then it came to light that she wasn't actually sociobiologically of that group. And there was a huge uproar in terms of, well, how can she call herself that, da, 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 da. From what little I've seen, there was a recent interview not too long ago with her. She still identifies, in other words, her self-identity is of being Black. However, the group that considers themselves Black, African American, everyone who labeled that group, doesn't accept her as a member. There was an issue with, I think it was Warren or some congressman or something like that, who was saying she was Native American. And then the same type of issue came up. Her self-identity included that, but that group was rather vague, or as I remember, not particularly supportive of her being a member of that. So ethnicity requires two parts to it. It's not who the person thinks they are, or I should say it's not only who the person thinks they are. The group that carries that label has to validate, or basically the stamp of approval that they accept the person as a member of that group. Now, it can also work the other way. One branch of my family is Native American and moved to California in the 19th century to get out of the Indian schools, the forced education system. And so they became Latinos. They presented themselves as being Mexican in California because that was a lot better than being a Native American in California when they moved out west. And so in that situation, even though the Native American population would accept them as a member, the individuals didn't want to be seen that way. So they relabeled themselves as another group. Now, I would assume the Mexican community probably gave a rat's ass what they were, and certainly didn't see them as members. But on the other hand, they spoke Spanish and da-da-da, so they probably went like whatevers, So in that situation, ethnicity, again, it can play both ways. You can be part of a group, but you don't accept it. That means you're not that ethnic group. You can say you're part of a group, the group doesn't accept you. You're not part of that ethnic group either. So it's not who people say they are. It's this very sort of complicated dance or relationship between validation by others and self-identity. And if you think about it, that's why here in Hawaii, it's not unusual to find people who are actually 2 or 3 or 4 maybe different ethnic groups. And in each case, and my friends, for example, in Upcountry Kula, they're both Chinese and Hawaiian. And they have no problem with that. And both those communities accept them as both of those things. So you can be multi-ethnic as an individual. But that's a rather, it's not unique to Hawaii, but it's much more common here than which you'd see in the rest of other places. Now, one of the interesting side effects of this is you can go to someplace like our sister school in Dayton, Ohio, and a large part of the folks that live there are either originally from Germany or from Scandinavia, I think largely Sweden. Now, those folks, because they become part of the Anglo-American elite structure, don't see themselves as being ethnic. So ethnicity is not something you need to have. You can be part of a culture. And in that case, because you're the group that's making the labels, oftentimes the group that makes the labels doesn't really see themselves as having a label. If you go to the UK, you'll find that the British very rarely see themselves as an ethnic group, but they certainly see the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scottish as ethnic groups. And those 3 groups have gotten pretty aggressive. They've gone to the 3rd stage. They got pretty aggressive about sort of taking control of those stereotypes of themselves. But the British, since they were the ones that made the rules, they conquered those areas, they ruled those areas, they ran those areas, they still do. They don't see themselves as being ethnic. And so oftentimes what you'll find is if you go to a place and you see that the group in charge doesn't see themselves as being ethnic, but they have other groups within their society they see as being ethnic, that tells you who's got the authority and power and who doesn't. And it varies tremendously. In Canada, it's very different than the United States. In Mexico, it's totally different than the United States or Canada. They're, especially with the Canadians and Americans, they're somewhat related cultures, but not as close as Americans like to think. But their idea of ethnicity is pretty radically different between the 2 places. So that's ethnicity and culture. So keep that in mind because you're seeing it around you all the time. Last, very quickly. Usually I do this in class with my props. Can't do that because we're not having class, so ain't gonna have the props done that way. I'm sending you some some links that'll show you how these function. The Hummel doll, which is over here, isn't working right now because I think it's gotten really old. It's tired. It's from 2006, so you know, poor girl's about 18 years old, 16 years old, and she's really tired. But this is a Hummel doll. These were built in Japan by Takara Tomy, which is a toy manufacturer, but they were paid for by the health ministry. So the government of Japan asked the company to make these things, and they basically subsidized their building. They were sold for about 3 or 4 years in Japan. I have one. Our provost has another one in his office of the other style. These, when I originally bought this one, you could only buy them if you're an adult. So in my case, I had to go into a department store, so like Macy's, their equivalent of Macy's, and you have to show a passport and a driver's license to prove that you're over 18. They would not sell these to anyone under the age of 18. You can only have one per family. It took me about an hour with a manager before they'd finally sell me one. So these were intended for adults. It looks like a doll, but it's actually a very complex robot, especially when you figure this is 2006. These things are stunningly sophisticated. It monitors heart rates, sleep rates, body temperatures. Has, I believe, 280 or 300 something different conversational things it does automatically. This is all pre-Wi-Fi, pre-wired, so this is all internal to the robot. It was intended for women, and I'll give you a hint. It was intended for women between the ages of 20 and 35 who are not married, which is a big issue in Japan, especially if you're on the age of 25 not married. The other group it was intended for is women over the ages of 55 and above. And of course, remember, Japan has the highest percentage of women over the age of 65 in the world, who were basically what you call empty nesters, because there was no one at home but themselves. That's the two groups this thing was intended for. It wasn't intended for guys. It was never intended. In fact, they'd be really pissed off if you gave it to a kid. So this is for those two groups of women. And what it did is it monitored how well you sleep, how stressed out you were, and how much rest you were getting. So you can go watch the video on this one. Secondly, so they quit making this after about 4 years. The government quit. The government was subsidized. My guess is these things cost about $1,000 each to make at the time, and you paid $300 for them. So I think that's probably one reason they gave me a hard time, because they're figuring it wasn't my taxes that were paying for this thing. They were very popular. You still find them around, but they quit doing them because the government changed their direction. They decided that the robots, though they worked, weren't exactly the way they wanted to pursue it, because I don't think they could afford it anymore. So that's sort of stage one. Stage two is your Gatebox video that I got the link to here. This was built in 2018. An absolutely fascinating website. If you use Chrome, I'm not sure about the other ones, but in Chrome you can actually set up so it has language translation. You can go to the Gatebox website and actually see the current iteration. These things are now available on Amazon Japan and other platforms. I believe they're, I'm going to say $2,000. I'm not sure, something like that. This is a holographic pot. So what you get is what looks like a big coffee pot, but the holographic robot inside actually interacts with you. They're actually really sophisticated from what I've seen. I can't afford one, and I don't know what the hell we do with that anyways here, but certainly would trip people out. But take a look at that one, and in many ways what you realize is it was intended for a different demographic of the Japanese population. But there's a bunch of similarities in the idea that you could have a robot companion, which is exactly what this thing was called. The Hummel doll was called a healing partner, a healing companion in 2006. Gatebox talks about it as your virtual wife. In fact, that's how it translates into English when you go to their website. And it's just you're buying a virtual spouse, female. Though there is a male version apparently, which I haven't seen a lot of promos on. All for Japanese society. So this goes back to our idea of culture. These are two physical or semi-physical aspects of Japanese culture, Japanese society in the 21st century. So what do you make of them? Okay, I'm not asking for your judgment on whether they're a good idea or a bad idea, but what does it tell you about Japanese attitudes towards things like robots? Last, This is Hasbro's cat. There's also a dog version. These are originally built, I believe, in 2016, 2017. They're hugely popular. They've been very, very successful. My sister actually works at a nursing home in Oregon. They've got a couple of them. They find that they're very effective with their older residents, especially ones that are in Alzheimer's dementia. It really is an effective device. These things are marketed by Hasbro. You might be able to hear it purring right now. It reacts, again, it has sensors, so it reacts to certain touches on certain parts. I can never remember exactly where. Since I only use these as props, I don't really have a lot of experience with them. There it goes. Absolutely fascinating devices, very cheap, about $100. But in some ways, this is this, when you're looking at this, you got to ask yourself, okay, this is designed again for adults. So like our two Japanese devices, this is an adult device. It's not intended for kids. Though I should point out that two of my nieces actually have one of these, and they're about 10 or 11. They can't have a pet at home, and they actually adore this thing. So, it's a little bit different demographic maybe. But again, it was intended for an adult audience, in this case, seniors. It's been heavily marketed. It's very, very successful. So what you've got here is this is an American social robot, or if you want to, empathic robot, just like its two Japanese counterparts. Different society, different culture, different values. So what you want to ask yourself in this is, what does this say about Americans? What does it say about American attitude towards the elderly? What does it say about American attitude towards pets? And why would the Hummel doll and Gatebox probably not work? I should point out Gatebox is supposed to be available in the United States by the end of this year. I'm not sure how well it's going to do. So what you've got is two very different societies, two very different set of values and attitudes, but you've got robots in all three of them. So when you do this is what we call this is part of what anthropologists do. They look at the things around us and how we use them. This is a big part of your Miller book. How we use technology to reinforce or structure the values and attitudes that make up our society. And all three of these, well, two that you can see, are examples of that same phenomenon of objects, in the same way that Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or some other social platform is actually an object, something that the people in the society use. So this is our puzzle. So these are your conundrums. Now you've got the Hatsune Miku, which I think I mentioned last time, is your actual sort of more in-depth one that you've got a reaction. But this is just intended as sort of like a mental exercise for you to sort of undergo for all this. Okay, so I'll try it.